Western bike brands like Trek, Specialized, Cannondale, Scott and Canyon are facing the biggest threat to their market dominance they've seen in decades. And it's coming not from each other, but from a wave of smaller, direct-to-consumer Chinese brands that a lot of cyclists haven't even heard of just a few years ago. But these smaller Chinese brands are producing frames that are stiffer, they're lighter, and sometimes even half the price of the big Western brands that have 50 years of history. And those Western brands are really starting to feel it. Ronan McLaughlin wrote an interesting article in the Escape Collective a couple of months ago, and an ex-Trek manager told him, "It's been a solid year and a half of just all red on the daily sales reports. Just down versus prior year, things are moving slowly." And just to be clear, I want both sides to succeed. The more competition, the more choice we have for consumers, the more innovation in the industry, and the lower the prices. What I do want to talk about is why this shift is happening, what's actually driving it, and why, because I reckon it won't even be too long into the future until most people in the West are riding Chinese branded bikes as opposed to Western branded bikes. So let's start with the most obvious factor. The price gap is getting harder to ignore. Now, I'm going to use Trek as an example for this video. Firstly, because they're the biggest Western bike brand, but also I have quite a few Trek bikes. I have one in the background here. I have countless Trek accessories. I have a fair bit of experience with buying their products from a consumer standpoint. If you go onto Trek's website right now and you look at their entry-level carbon road bikes, you're looking at somewhere around $3,000 to $3,500 for an entry-level carbon bike. For that money, you're getting a decent frame, you're getting Shimano 105 mechanical, but only 23mm aluminium wheels. Now we go and look at a brand like Windspace to see what they are selling for that same $3,000. And straight away you're getting a full carbon frame set, Shimano Di2 electronic shifting, and 50mm carbon wheels. I have a Chinese-made SAVA A7L Pro I bought with my own money for about $1,500. I also bought an American-made Trek Domane SL5, also with my own money for about $3,500. But the SAVA came with aero handlebars with fully integrated cables. The Trek has non-aero handlebars and not fully integrated cables. The SAVA has carbon aero seat posts with an extremely comfortable saddle. The Trek has a carbon non-aero seat post with a quite comfortable saddle. But here's the big one. The SAVA comes with 50mm carbon wheels as standard. The Trek gives you these kind of spindly 21mm aluminium wheels as stock, which I replaced immediately with aftermarket 50mm carbon wheels. The SAVA weighs in at 8.9 kilograms, very slightly lighter than the Trek, which weighs about 9 kilograms. Both bikes have a Shimano 105 mechanical group set. Now, the Trek has a few advantages. For example, the Trek has 38mm tire clearance compared with SAVA's tiny 28mm tire clearance. And the Trek also has ISO-speed technology that dampens bumps, making the ride smoother. That is actually really nice to have. And it has in-frame storage, and you can actually go to your local store and buy the Trek, whereas the SAVA you have to order from China. Now, they're not exactly the same type of bike. One is a budget aero bike, one is a mid-range road bike, but you're saving $2,000 if you buy the SAVA A7L Pro. $2,000, that's not a small amount of money. So how can companies like SAVA price their bikes so competitively? To answer that question, we need to talk about manufacturing. The majority of carbon bikes in the world, including Trek, Specialized and Cannondale, they're still manufactured in Taiwan or mainland China anyway. So the notion that buying a Chinese brand means you're getting an inferior manufacturing process is at this point somewhat outdated. The factories building frames for some of the biggest Western brands are, in some cases, the same factories that Chinese direct-to-consumer brands are using or operating themselves. The difference is what happens after the frame comes out of the mold. So Trek alone has a dealer network of over 1,700 physical retail stores across North America. That was accelerated in 2020 and 2021 when it accelerated the rate at which it was acquiring and setting up new physical stores. But over the last few years, as the number of visitors shopping at physical stores continues to rapidly decrease, Trek finds itself in a position where it now has to pay huge chunks of money every month for stores that not as many people that they would have liked are visiting. every cost of maintaining and supporting that network of stores, you've got staff, you've got training, you've got warranty support, you've got merchandising, logistics, that gets baked into the price of every bike they sell. And that's before you even get to marketing budgets, sponsoring World Tour Pro teams, athlete contracts, trade show presence, and all the kind of traditional brand building activities that companies like Trek have been doing for decades. Now, Chinese direct-to-consumer brands have almost none of that, almost. They sell online, they ship directly to the customer and run relatively lean operations. Most Chinese brands don't have physical stores. That's not a criticism, that's a structural advantage, and it flows directly into the price you pay. And that's not the only area where the Chinese are running more efficiently. So Trek have a whole ecosystem of products, from water bottles to bike lights to helmets to bells, luggage, multi-tools, bike pumps. The idea being, when someone walks into a Trek store, they can buy a bike, but they can also buy all the accessories that ever need to fit their new bike. The problem is, accessories need to be updated every few years, and when your overhead structure is as heavy as Trek's, reinvesting in low margin accessory lines becomes harder and harder to justify. And Trek knows this. In 2024, Bicycle Retailer wrote an interesting article where Trek president John Burke said, "The global bike market is in chaos with high inventory levels at wholesale and retail levels leading to significant and continued discounting." He also said, in addition to a 10% cut in spending, Trek would substantially reduce its stock keeping units, or SKUs, saying Trek's model year 2026 SKUs will be 40% lower than model year 2024. And now you have a situation where Trek have stopped investing in a lot of their accessories, but they still have a lot of quite outdated bike accessories to shift in their stores and on their website. For example, their Trek Commuter Pro RT front bike light was launched in 2022 and is still being sold at full price of $145 on their website. And someone who has reviewed more than 20 bike lights in the last year alone, the brightness, the battery life, the weight, almost every feature of the bike light is lagging behind other bike lights selling at significantly lower than the price of the Trek Commuter Pro RT is going for. Same with their Bontrager Comp Road pedal set, selling for $90 on Trek's website. They initially came out in 2020. They're using old technology. They're significantly heavier than competitor pedals and more expensive. And I know this because I bought a set from my local store just a few weeks, about a month or a month and a half ago, for my indoor bike. And the Shimano and Honorary pedals that I have just run rings around the Bontrager pedals. I also know this because I've reviewed, it's got to be close to 100 bike accessories at this point on this channel, and I've entered them all into one big leaderboard and scored them out of 100, and I do update it very regularly, usually every week. If you want to check that leaderboard out, I'll drop a link in the description below. Okay, this business model of developing and manufacturing bikes and wheels and accessories maybe worked 5 years ago, maybe worked 10 years ago, but it's not efficient. The Chinese manufacturers, on the other hand, they tend to focus on just frames and wheels, or just accessories. They choose one or two products and they get really good at making those one or two products, as opposed to trying to make everything. The parallel I keep coming back to is what's happening in the car industry. So Chinese car manufacturers have gone from being a bit of a joke in Western markets to putting real pressure on European, on American, on Japanese brands in a relatively short period of time. The quality improved, the value proposition became impossible to dismiss, and consumers started paying attention regardless of what the legacy brands said about them. You can see here data from Bloomberg on how China's car production was almost 0% in 2000, and in 2024 it overtook all other regions and is now at almost 40%. You think about how many Chinese car brands you saw out on the roads just 5 years ago, and how many you're seeing these days. And I think a similar thing is happening with bikes, just a little more quietly. I see the Chinese and the Western bike market from a slightly different perspective because I review both Chinese and Western bike products, whether it's bike frames, carbon wheels, or accessories. And the difference in how the two groups approach marketing is also quite interesting. So Chinese brands, whether it's carbon wheels companies, whether it's frame set brands, whether it's component manufacturers, some of them, or relatively often, they reach out. They say, we have a product, we'd love for you to test it, and we understand you'll share your honest opinion, including any negatives, are you interested on featuring the product on your channel? And some of the time, that's exactly how it plays out. I test the product, I make a video, and you watch it for free on YouTube. But on this channel, ideally, I want to review both Chinese bikes and Western bikes. The problem is, in the 2 years I've been running this channel, I've spent probably more than $15,000 of my own money on Trek bikes, on Western wheels, on Western accessories. That's not a complaint about Western manufacturers or Trek as a company. They make really good bikes. I genuinely like a lot of their products, but their marketing is predominantly offline. For example, Trek's top professional cycling team is co-sponsored by Lidl, the supermarket chain. Now, that partnership is called the Lidl Trek Team, and Lidl's logo is plastered across the jerseys of some of the best riders in the world at races like Tour de France. Now, running a World Tour Pro team costs a lot of money. And the idea is that all of those TV viewers watching the race see that logo, and that builds the brand. And that model worked really well for a very long time. The problem is the way that people discover and choose bikes has fundamentally shifted. More people are researching on like Reddit, on Facebook, on YouTube. They're reading independent reviews from people who have actually ridden the product for months. And in that world, the brands that are putting products in reviewers' hands have an enormous visibility advantage over the ones that aren't. So does this mean that Chinese brands are always better? Absolutely, absolutely not. There are legitimate areas where the bigger Western brands still hold real advantages. After sales support, for example, if something goes wrong with your Trek and you're anywhere near a Trek dealer, you have a place to walk in and get help. With direct-to-consumer Chinese brands, your support is usually email-based, sometimes with a language barrier, and warranty claims can be slower and more complicated depending on where you're based. Resale value is another. A Trek or Specialized holds its value much better on the second-hand market than most Chinese brands. Part of that is brand recognition, right? Part of it is trust, part of it is just that more people are familiar with the name. If you buy a bike with the intention of selling it in a couple of years, that is worth factoring in. And fit and support infrastructure matters quite a lot when buying a bike. On Trek's website, their sizing tools, their dealer network for fitting, that's a real thing. A lot of Chinese brands are still kind of catching up on making the buying process feel smooth and supported end to end, particularly for riders who are new to the sport and need more hand-holding. The trajectory is clear though. 5 years ago, you could reasonably argue that the quality gap between a Chinese bike and a Western bike justified the price difference. Today, for a large portion of the market, that argument is getting harder to make. Chinese brands have gotten better at quality control. They've improved their paint and finishing, their frame sets are being tested and certified to the same standards, and the riding experience on a well-spec'd Chinese carbon bike is frankly very, very good. What they haven't quite cracked yet is brand perception among casual or new riders. The cyclists who have been around long enough to do the research, read the forums, watched the reviews, they kind of get that Chinese brands are worth it because they're cheaper to a certain extent. But walk into a conversation with someone who's just getting into cycling and ask them what brands they know, Trek, Specialized, Giant, Cannondale, that brand awareness built over decades is genuinely valuable, and it's not going to disappear overnight. The question for the big Western brands is whether they can adapt their cost structures and their marketing approaches fast enough to stay relevant as the information landscape continues to shift. Because the cyclists doing their research online are increasingly finding that for the money, the Chinese brands are very, very hard to argue against. There are a lot of Chinese bike brands popping up, so I made another video right here titled Chinese Bike Brands Explained, a complete beginner's guide. You can click on the card on the screen to watch that. Alternatively, I made a full review of the Chinese-made SAVA A7L Pro last year. You can watch that video by clicking here.